Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H Virtual Event Space. Today we are talking about photographing flowers for transparency. And for that, I would like to welcome Harold Davis to the program. Harold, how's it going?
Hi, Derek. So nice to see you.
Good to see you. I wish we had you in person. I know last time, it's been a while since you've sauntered into the B&H event space. We had to do the virtual thing this time around, but nonetheless, it's good to have you on.
Well, it's always so much fun to visit B&H in New York. So I was hoping on my last trip I would get to do it. But what are you going to do?
Exactly, exactly. But I'm going to turn it over to you. Very interesting program for you guys today. I'm not even going to begin to throw dirt on this because Harold, what you're doing is way beyond anything I could create. Super interesting content, and I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
That sounds great, Derek. Well, so my name is Harold Davis. I like to say I'm an artist, photographer, writer, and educator, possibly in that order. And without much further ado, I am going to share my screen and get started on my presentation. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Derek, for inviting me. I really do appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to having a blast with everyone. And hopefully you'll learn something from this too. Or maybe I will. Who knows? Anyhow, let me share my screen. All right, so this is photographing flowers for transparency. If you are here for, I don't know, model photography or something, you are certainly in the wrong place. But photo flowers have it all as far as I'm concerned. So let's have fun. This is my most recent book, Composition and Photography, and I will give you a discount code for purchasing it from the publisher at the end of this presentation. This is Creative Garden Photography, a book I wrote a couple of years ago. It has the most of any of my books about the techniques that are shown in this presentation. So I want to make it clear that there's more than just gardens in this book. It's making great photos of flowers, gardens, landscapes, and the beautiful world around us. And here's a table of contents. The part that it's about this kind of photography is called Taking the Garden Inside. It's the whole second half of the book. And there are a whole bunch of creative macro kinds of techniques for flower photography in that part of the book. You can see also there are a lot of figures in the book showing how you work with exposure histograms in this kind of photography and the things that we'll be getting into later in this presentation. Then Creative Black and White, the second revised and expanded edition, is also a recent book of mine. And Photographing Flowers, this is from Focal Press, and it's part of what started it off. And some of my older books, which some of these are still out there and still in print and have ideas worth having a look at. Recently, the US Post Office published a couple of, actually 8 stamps based on my work. They also published this note card series that you can see here from my Tulip Pano Forever stamp. You can go up on the US Post Office website or go to your local post office and buy it. When I was in the process of negotiating the contracts for these stamps, which was an interesting life experience, they told me, and this is really true, that you should think of the US Post Office as a business with 90,000 retail outlets. So a lot of stamps get printed. This is the sunflower bouquet stamp image, which essentially is a 2-ounce forever stamp. The idea that the post office had was that it would go well on things like wedding invitations, things that were greeting cards, something that you wanted a decorative stamp on. Here's a photograph of the Tulip Pano as a print, as a large size print coming out of my printer. And I'm also pleased that I am the 2022 Photographic Society of America Progress Award winner. This has been awarded mostly annually to a person involved in the development of photography, either visual or technical, and past award winners include Walt Disney, Edward Weston, Ansel Adams, the inventor of the semiconductor, Robert Noyce, filmmaker Ken Burns, and Photoshop maker Thomas Knoll. So obviously, this is a distinguished crowd to be part of, and specifically the award noticed the technique that you're about to see. Here are a few, okay, I don't have to toot my own horn too much. Here's the table of contents for the presentation that you're going to see. This isn't really a conventional table of contents, but why do it? Well, we'll find out about that. Who is your mama? When you look at a pixel is a digital object, and it doesn't know where it came from. It doesn't know whether you got it by pushing the button in a camera, by running something through a scanner, by using a digital paintbrush, by rephotographing a painting. Okay, so that's what Who is Your Mama is about. Where do the pixels in these images come from? Life is an illusion. The whole idea of transparency is an odd idea, visually speaking. First of all, when something is 100% transparent, can you see it? No. So really what I am talking about in this presentation is a concept called translucency, partial transparency. When something is fully transparent, truly fully translucent, it is transparent. When something is 0% translucent, it is opaque. You get translucency by contrasting lights and darks, and I will talk more about that and when we get to that section of my presentation. Arrangement. This technique of photography is fundamentally about flower arrangement and about composition. I like to say that you can teach technical processes fundamentally to, I don't know, a robot, a monkey. I'm not sure whom, me, maybe. So it can be taught, but the arrangement is the hard part. It's the hardest part of any of this work. I will also show you how to expose these images, how to process them, and make some remarks on how you might consider presenting them. So one thing to note about this tulip is that it's gestural. So when you're working with flower photography, the gestures, the arms on this tulip, I like to anthropomorphize my flowers to think of them like people. Here with these daffodils, they're piled up like that, and the part of it that was as hardest to make is the sort of onion skin on the daffodils. We'll note that we've got one tulip, we have two daffodils, here we have three peonies. This image, interestingly, is a rephotograph of a print on washi, on Awagami Undo washi, distributed in this country by my sponsor, Moab Paper. And it's a beautiful paper that has these flecks in it that are mulberry flecks, sometimes called dragon's breath. And here we have, well, actually, there are 5 Brugmansia, angel trumpet flowers, and 5 irises, white irises, and 5 poppies. And here are the next set of postage stamps of my work. So this is why I started with the 1, 2, 3 sequence, because these are what are issued this year in 2024 and are what are called miscellaneous stamps. You can see that the post office has put a line through the pricing on these stamps so that nobody can take these, reproduce them, and say, fine, we have stamps now. The truth is that I can't use anybody's postage but my own now. And I got to tell you, it is a hell of a kick to have incoming mail, such as it is these days, with my own stamps postmarked on them. Okay, why do it? Well, corn poppies. These are Papava roeas corn poppies, perhaps one of the most common kind of poppies. And the chance to light them like this from behind is about gestures and about gestural feeling. Remember that the word photography itself means drawing with light. So being able to backlight my flowers like this gets a form of writing with light that is very unusual, and these flowers do not look the same way when you backlight it. You can use the techniques that I'm explaining here to photograph all kinds of things besides flowers. For example, here are some snap peas in pods, and here's an Arctectonica spiral shell, an architectural shell. When we're looking at this shell, let's think about what happens when you photograph something on just a regular white background. So here, as a thought experiment, take a white card of some kind, put something, let's say a shell like this on top of the card, and photograph it on it using what your camera says is the right exposure. Put your camera on automatic and press the button. What the thought experiment is, what will the background look like? Okay, background is going to go gray because your camera is expecting an 18% gray component and an exposure. So if you want it to be white, using conventional lighting, what you have to do is separate the subject from the background and light each separately with more light on the background. Otherwise, you will always get a gray background. So the other way to avoid this is to photograph using literal backlighting, like the light box that I use here. The setup for this little picture, it was that the light was vertical behind the setup and the picture itself was on a mirror, and I was photographing down into the mirror so you can see the reflection at the bottom. My idea here was to create a image that reminded the viewer of a Dutch pen and ink drawing. Here with an image like this, the idea, or this one, the idea is to take a lot of psychedelic drugs. No, I'm only kidding. Anyhow, so what you do is you make photographs like the Nautilus, and then you combine them in a composite in Photoshop afterwards. So you can create images and pieces and assemble them. And here, this butterfly started out as a light box image of a butterfly, more or less monochromatic, and I painted in the colors in Photoshop. The same story on this dragonfly. Both the butterfly and the dragonfly were commission pieces for a series of books about extraordinary events in nature. And this butterfly is done the same way with a replication of the butterfly off the light box and some Photoshop work to create the colors. At this point, I like to say that you can create compelling images using this technique without a great fancy camera. These are iPhone images, and I love my iPhone camera. It does things in some cases that my big boy camera can't do, but you know, you also don't need a great camera, and you always have the iPhone with you. So these are iPhone photographing flowers for transparency images. Who is your mama? Where did the pixels in these images come from? Well, here's a nice panorama. And by panorama, when I'm talking about a panorama here, what I mean is that it's been stitched together in post-production. So if you look at an image like this, and if it's a three-piece panorama, which is roughly right in terms of the proportions of the image, then since these are all multi-exposure composites of something like 6 to 8 images, so you're looking at 18 to 24 images that go into this in post-production. A lot of the times, my images end up being reproduced quite large contexts in architectural installations and a lot of the times in hospitals and hotels and things like that. And I need high resolution originals. So that's part of the reason that these are created as composites. I'll show you toward the end of this presentation some examples of how my work is used that way. This image is what's called an LAB inversion of the previous image. So it's a simple 10-second move in Photoshop to go from here to here. And I like to say that's a twofer. All you really do is you convert it to LAB color, you select the L, the black and white information channel, and you go image adjustment invert. This is covered in great detail in my creative garden photography book. And it's also on my website. I have an FAQ about it. I have many webinars that are listed on my website that are free to watch. And I also have a LinkedIn learning course on LAB color. The link is on my website. So many people have free access to LinkedIn learning that you can learn more about this than perhaps you ever wanted to know fairly easily. These dahlias I will come back to in a minute as an exposure example. Life is an illusion. Well, that is so true, isn't it? Who knows? This is a photograph, a macro photograph of, because it's a pretty small flower, of a star magnolia. Um, it's an excellent example of the illusion of translucency, because if you look at a couple of places where the petals of the Magnolia stellata are over the stem, you can see that the stem looks black. But how does it look black and why? Well, it looks black because I painted it more darkly and I painted the area around it lightly. So translucency is visually created by the contrast of lights and darks. I like to use this quote from Walter Isaacson, who's done biographies of many people. Steve Jobs is quite a good book. I'm not quite so sure about Isaacson's latest, but anyhow, he wrote one about Leonardo da Vinci. And chiaroscuro, from the Italian for light dark, is the use of contrasts of light and shadow as a modeling technique for achieving the illusion of three-dimensional volume in a two-dimensional drawing or painting. Yes, Leonardo was perhaps the greatest Renaissance practitioner of chiaroscuro used in this way. And chiaroscuro is the technique that you'll see in the stem sections of this Magnolia stellata photograph. So here are some more why do it images. With this cherry blossom branch, the technique involved putting the branch in a vase, getting back from it a distance so I could isolate it from the background, and lighting it from the back with a light pad using a moderate telephoto lens to photograph the blossoms. With this image, the idea I had was to create a sense of motion in the wind with the pods of the seed blowing around between these poppies. Before I move on to arrangement, Derek, are there any questions that it would be great to answer here?
Well, we did have a question. Mary just wanted to know again the name of the book that you had mentioned about flower transparency earlier.
It's my creative garden photography book published by Rocky Nook.
Okay. And I do have a question, Harold, on the types of flowers that you're using. Is there anything different? Do they all photograph the same with this technique, or are there certain types of flowers where you have to tweak your technique to fit the makeup of the flower?
You know, Derek, that is a great question and also leads rather well into the next section of the presentation. But not all flowers are equal in terms of translucency in point of fact.
Okay.
And if you have something that is not at all translucent or transparent, it's pretty hard to use this technique on it except to create a white background. The flowers that are most translucent are, in no particular order, poppies or the popover, tulips, and flowers like anemones, also Peruvian lilies, Alstroemeria. Roses can be pretty solid and can be pretty hard to photograph this way, and there are other flowers that this technique doesn't work for. It's fair to say that the bulk of the flowers you've seen and that I photograph are flowers I grow in my garden. So part of what I do is I'm a pretty avid hobby gardener, and I live in a place where almost everything grows well. So it's a great question. And but I think in fairness also that the flowers that I don't grow that I photograph mostly come from Trader Joe's. So there are places to buy photographs you can use for this almost all year round, no matter where you are. But the fact of the matter is that my garden is planted for flowers that have good translucency indexes. That's a great question. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
So, correct handling of flowers refines the personality. Well, if you're Japanese, that's a great sentiment. And I do recommend the study of Ikebana, Japanese flower arrangement, as a good discipline for how to do these kinds of arrangements. The thing to keep in mind is that part of the art of photography is creating order and structure out of a disorganized world around us. So most of my compositions that you've seen have an underlying structure. The underlying structure of this composition of um, irises and corn poppies of Papaveroeus are the stalks of the iris. So that is one of the most common ways to organize and compose a light box image, is to use upright stalks and arrange the rest of the flowers around them. Here's another common arrangement. This is I spent the year 2020, when I stopped being able to travel in about March, with growing and photographing dahlias. So this is a spiral or mandala created of dahlias and fuchsias. So the spiral, the round image, is a good possibility. Here is an example with pebbles and fruits and vegetables of a double spiral. So moving back to looking at a light box, here's a floral arrangement on a light box. This is photographed straight down on it. We'll talk more about that later. This is photographed actually in the room where I am sitting now. I don't typically photograph in here these days, and the room looks a good bit different, but this gives you the idea. And here's the image. Another panorama. This one is a thistle, and the moral of this, it's about 5 feet tall. It was about 5 feet tall. I cut it. I wore thick hide gardening gloves, and I cut it off the median strip of a boulevard near here. And the moral here is we always hurt the ones we love, because it drew blood even through the gloves. Like the cherry blossom photo that I showed a while back, this one is photographed upright with lights behind it at a distance with a moderate telephoto lens. When I do workshops on this technique, one of the common questions I get is, what lens do I bring? What lens do I use? Interestingly, most of what I've shown you are not macro photos, but zoom lenses are problematic because of zoom creep when you're facing the camera straight down. So what you want is a good prime lens. In a full frame camera, that's roughly 50 millimeters or 55 millimeters in length, and most of the manufacturers make really good and relatively inexpensive prime lenses. So this is another arrangement motif, if you will, and this is the bouquet coming straight up. It's a little bit different than the first one I showed, which was a vertical stalk, because this is spreading out. You can imagine a vase below this. These tulips are all congregated. It's a society of tulips. So this is another one of the common design patterns for this kind of image, with the stalks down below. Here is one where I've omitted the stalks It's mostly made of hydrangea petals, which, if you looked at a hydrangea, you'll know that a hydrangea flower is made up of all these little petals. So these are cut off from the petal heads and then arranged. So this is another Magnolia stellata, which grows typically as a kind of bush or shrub, uh, or maybe low tree. So if you look at this and you say to yourself, I'm looking at a shrub in nature, you could then say to yourself, well, what about this isn't quite right? In fiction, and when you write fiction, if you write a novel, they have an idea called suspension of disbelief. So nobody really believes that most of the stuff in novels is true. That convicts chinking with chains in Charles Dickens or whatever. But it's all plausible enough, and you get caught up in it and you believe it. Well, our job as visual artists and photographers is also to create a kind of visual suspension of disbelief. So that's the thought here. The fact is that in nature, the petals don't all face the camera. You can't say cheese and have the petals turn towards you. Probably in a bush this size, you'd see one or two petals facing the camera, but most of them are going to be kind of sideways. So the process for creating this is to go find a nice branch on a shrub and cut it off, bring it inside, and cut it up and rearrange it on the light box so that the petals face front. Here's a similar kind of composition with clematis. This is another image of mine that's been used as a book cover a couple of times. And again, we have an inversion here, so it's a two for the price of one. These are papaver. Before I get to the exposures, Derek, are we good to go? Do we have questions?
Good on questions for now.
All righty. So here's the 10-cent version of how to expose one of these images. The goal is to create a white background. There are 7 to 10 exposures involved. You start completely overexposed, and I'm going to put a footnote for there. It's easy to start completely overexposed, but you could also start in the middle. You use manual exposure. You bracket shutter speeds. You don't want to bracket aperture, because if you bracket aperture, you may get differing depths of field and it may change the image. You use 1 EV increments, so each exposure lets in twice the light or half the light of the previous one. And you stop when you get to the middle, to the dark side. You don't need anything dark in this image. And I say reserve an HDR blend. That really involves the processing of the images, because one of the first things I do when I shoot a sequence like this and process it is I run it through an automated HDR program like Photoshop or Lightroom or Nik HDR or Luminar. I don't really much care which HDR program, and I set aside the results from that. Here's a typical underexposure histogram. Here's a typical overexposure histogram on the right side, on the bottom. Consider what a histogram actually is. I mean, we've all heard this kind of fancy term, but really a histogram just means a bar graph. And an exposure histogram is a bar graph of the values of lights and darks in front of the camera. That's exactly what an exposure histogram is. So in all reality, in all honesty, you're given an idea that an exposure histogram should look something like the black line parabola in this diagram, but that's not really true. It depends on what you care about in the image and what the sequence of lights and darks that the camera is facing are. What the red loop around here shows about the parts of the exposure histogram that in the case of photographing flowers for transparency, we care about. We don't care about the things that are to the left of the median line. All we want are the things that are to the right of the median line. And why is that? Think about it for a second. If If it gets dark, well, the gray in the background will get dark and the petals will get dark, and you won't have transparency or translucency anymore. So we don't want those values. We want them right up to the midline because there might be something in the color there. And we don't want them any further than that. What I'm going to say something here that is interesting because what I'm doing with this technique more broadly is I'm taking pieces, I'm taking different exposure pieces, different values of the image, and then pasting them together in post-production where I want them. So essentially, I can control every exposure value in the final image, depending upon how granular I want to get with it. This is a photograph of dahlias. I showed earlier versions of it. And here's the exposure sequence that led to this image. So you can see on the upper left, we have a 4-second exposure, then 1 EV less than that, 2 seconds, 1 second, half a second, a quarter of a second, an eighth of a second, a 15th of a second, a 30th of a second. At a 30th of a second, you get to this midpoint here on the histogram, and you don't need to take any more because you can see that at a 30th of a second, the fronts of the flowers have gone all black and there's going to be nothing useful there. By the way, to close a parentheses and go back to a footnote I had, if you prefer to start at a 30th of a second and go to 4 seconds, that's fine. There's no real impetus for which direction you do it in. This gives you a pretty good idea of the exposure range that goes into one of these images. This is 8 exposures going from 4 seconds to a 30th of a second. If you do the math, that's about a 120 times range from the darkest to the lightest exposure. Keep in mind that each EV is half or twice the previous. So this is a logarithmic kind of progression when you do it. Very exciting. It's very easy to do in practice. So don't get too scared to try it yourself. But this is the idea. And the broader idea, again, is that you can use each of these exposures. And you can see if you look at the spread here, that the colors are perhaps neatest somewhere in the middle. But you can use each part of what you want to make what you want. Here's the 4-second exposure. Hardly any saturation or anything there. Here is the 1/30th of a second exposure, totally dark and basically useless. And this, by the way, is what you would get if you put your camera on automatic and just took the picture. So never believe your camera is smarter than you are. You are smarter than your camera. Here's some more examples. Dahlias on a light box. This is a upright structure like that. Anything, Derek, before I go on to processing?
Yes, sir. We do actually have a question. Quick clarification. Judy says you mentioned light boxes and light pads. Are you speaking of two different things, or are you using the terms interchangeably?
Great question. I'm using the terms synonymously. They're interchangeable. You know, it used to be that a light box was a three-dimensional thing with daylight fluorescent tubes in it. These days, they're more like pads that have LEDs and are very thin. But I use the terms interchangeably. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I
And if we
also
can,
want to point out that the FAQs on my website have ideas about where you might buy a light box, and also links to a plan with a bill of materials for building your own out of supplies from Home Depot with a cost of materials of about $100.
all right. And Harold, can we sneak one more question in? Warren was asking if you ever fake transparency digitally if it can't be attained with the light box.
Can we clarify that question? Do I ever fake it digitally?
Yeah, is there any digital manipulation that you can do if you can't obtain it with the light box? Or is
Well,
it one of those
yes.
things where
Yes, I mean, translucency. So remember where I started with transparency. That transparency is 100% translucent. Opacity is 0% translucent. So translucency is basically, by its very meaning, an issue of degree. And there's some degree of translucency that you can generate in post-production without a light box by using the chiaroscuro technique that I showed, by painting lines in darker and lighter. And I sometimes do some of this. For example, I will put a white overlay over parts of an image that I want to look more translucent, and then I will paint that in at about 10% opacity. But you can't take an image from nothing to nicely translucent just in post-production. It usually works best as a combination of photography and post-production. Thanks. That's a great question.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Okay. So here's the 10-cent version of post-processing. This is assuming that you have taken the images through Photoshop, through Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop. And I should say right now that it's fine with me if you take them through Lightroom rather than Adobe Camera Raw. As many of you may know, Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom use the same processing engines under the covers. So whatever is easier for you to use is fine. You do need to take them into Photoshop, though, because you do need to be able to use layer masking, and Photoshop's paintbrush tool to do this right. Start with the most overexposed image. The most overexposed image becomes the bottom of a layer stack. Use the same processing techniques, whether in Adobe Camera Raw, ACR, or Lightroom, or another third-party program. Add the darker images with layering, layer masks, and the brush tool. And remember, we had some reserved HDR blend. Consider adding that at the top of the stack to add punch to the whole thing. So here's an example with that dahlia. You'll see at the bottom is the 4-second version of the image, totally white. Now, what happens when you look down a layer stack in Photoshop from the top? I like to think of it, I'm going to put in a couple of food metaphors here. I like to think of this as a stack of pancakes. If your top layer is at normal blending mode and 100% opacity, all you see is the top layer. That's like a pancake with butter and maple syrup before you start eating into it. Once you change either the blending mode or the opacity, you start to see down through it. So the way this technique works is the bottom of the image is going to have the white background. So you want that to be there 100%. And then the things you layer on top of it get less and less and less as you go up the layer stack. So one way to think of this is like a wedding cake. The bottom stack of the wedding cake is high, then you get a little less high, then you get a little less high, and up at the top, it's just the frosting on top. So the HDR blend that's put on top is the frosting. And here are some more examples. This is a nice Danish poppy. Here are some sunflowers. This image the publisher chose for the front of my Creative Garden photography book, a panorama there. Interesting to note that the sunflowers themselves are not particularly translucent, particularly the core of the sunflower. So one thing you have to think about there is lighting the front side as well as the back side of flowers in this situation. Here's one, I call this one Salutation to the Sun. Here's another arrangement idea, and that is to put crosshatches in apparently a chaotic way into the composition and make it seem like it's the sort of vortex of the whole wide universe. there's my nice printer being delivered into a room the kids say is formerly called the dining room, and now it's our printing room. So yeah, it's a big printer. What you can do is easily put an image that's been created on white onto almost any background you like. Here, my poppies that I showed a little earlier are placed on a scanned washi image made from scanned paper. A local art supply store is a good place to find paper you can scan for this kind of usage. One thing I like to do is to create a background. This background I created in Photoshop by scanning a sheet of papyrus and a sheet of washi, and then blending the two. And then you can use it to unify a set of images, because everything you put within the frame of the background is going to look like it's part of the other, and you could actually frame it, hang it in a sequence, that kind of thing. Here's a scanned piece of paper that works nicely as a background. Some Easter lilies and dahlias on the scanned background. And here, bamboo, very simple image on a nice scanned background. With this image, the background is a baking tin, basically. So, you can use the techniques that I've shown here, not just for a light box, but also for a dark background. One thing that I have found with people who have really learned the light box technique through my workshop is that the exposure techniques here really work across a wide range of photography. When I travel and do photographs on the road, I'm often break out my tripod and do a sequence. And part of the point of that is that I can blend my exposures together at any point that I like. So this is a technique that you can really learn by following through with photographing flowers for transparency. Of course, in this one, the pebbles here are not transparent. The mandala, or circle, is a very, very, very common design pattern for floral imagery. And here's contrasting complementary colors. With this image, what I did was I used food color and drawings, and I put them in a tray of water, and I put the tray of water on the light box, and I created the composition that way. Here's stalks going up with dahlias. With single flowers or petals, as in the ones I showed at the beginning of this image, I'm really inclined to be interested in gesture. So I think of this tulip petal that's a bit on the old side as a high-stepping dancer. And the same thing here with this lily. It's an opera singer. Here, this one is really spider-like. It was so spider-like to me that I left in the hook that I used to mount it above the light box. Is a honeysuckle. I have been experimenting with a kind of light box composition that appears to be random but isn't. So I've called it artfully random. Here, this one is tulips like stained glass. And here, more anthropomorphization of tulips as a couple. Here they're dancing. This is a nice close dance. Dee dee, and so on. The white flowers are Matiea poppies, which are native to the California range, one of the few poppies that really are. I have a nice big bush in one of my gardens. With this, the idea is to create a stained glass look. And here's more stained glass with the blue clematis. The poppies here. These are some examples of the group of flowers possibilities of arrangement. What is also possible on a light box is to do an image like this, which is a macro, a close-up image, where the point is the channel of light that directs the eyes going down rather than overall translucency. And here again, another macro. I like to do floral arrangements like this mandala with these are Peruvian lily petals surrounding a proteus in the center. And here it is on black, inverted. I think that's actually more spectacular even than the version on white. Another mandala and inversion. Here's the proteus from the center. Here's a clematis. This image, which you may have seen as the splash screen, is interesting because it's 50% an X-ray and 50% a light box image combined. These are roses and ranunculus, and you see both the inside and the outside of the flowers. When I say X-ray, I mean literal X-ray. These were taken with medical X-ray machines, and as was the sunflower. And one more mandala with a starfish, not a sunflower, in the center. This one I just did recently, and it's very meditative to arrange these things, the white version. With this one, my idea is that the flowers are talking to me, and and they're looking at you. They've done a good job of saying cheese because, of course, I can control them and control how they look. The heart. This image was photographed on a seamless setup, so it's not really a light box image, but the same translucent techniques were used on it with the multi-exposure bracketing and how I put the images together. I was asked by a client to create this frame for basically an invitation kind of thing on the inside, so I used a light box to do it. And here's a sort of square spiral, which again looks pretty cool in the inverted version. So I promised this is a mural that I recently was commissioned to do for a prominent Boston Children's Hospital. It is going in the pediatric area. A pediatric cardiac area. So it was designed with a heart image that I showed a little back going in the center of this image here, going in the center panel of the diamond. And here's another mural. This one's about 12 feet wide for the same institution. And the year of the dragon commences on Saturday. I am a dragon, so here's my Lightbox dragon. Discount codes for the books. If you go to the publisher, Rocky Nook, and use H Davis 40 at checkout, you'll get a 40% discount. Nice discount. You can also buy the print and the ebook version at the same time for it's only a $10 edition. It's kind of worth it. Garden 40 works for creative garden photography, and H Davis 40 for creative black and white. Here's how you reach me. Here's how you learn more about me. My Instagram is at Harold L. Davis. If you have questions, you can write me. I do like getting email and responding to it. And we have some time for some questions, I think, Derek.
Definitely. That was super engaging. It only took them a little while, Harold, to get them opened up to the questions, but once we got it open, they started flowing. So let's start with a question. Just for clarification, what does he mean by the same processing techniques on each layer?
So what I said there was when you take it through Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, you use the same processing settings. So in other words, if you look at the controls when this happens, when you develop it in Lightroom or when you process it in Adobe Camera Raw, you can set exposure, up or down. You can set saturation up or down. You can set and you have a lot of other settings that are less important than those two that you can change. What I'm saying is you want to use the same thing on each layer, and actually usually I just accept the default for this process.
Okay, we had a couple questions on the front lighting. Judy points out on the photo with the pebbles and the flowers, she noticed no shadows. She wanted to know how you lit the front. And Warren is asking, how much front lighting do you use? And do you use a light meter to establish your front to back ratios?
On the second, I'll get to the lighting, which is a great question in a minute. On the second question there, I don't use a light meter, other than perhaps the one that's built into the camera anyhow. But I don't use a handheld light meter in addition. I remember those days, back in those days. Uh, the Yeah, so here's a problem. If you light it strongly from the front, then you won't get the translucency coming through the petals. So this is a judgment call. You need some lighting on the front, and sometimes just whatever ambient lighting there is where you're doing the photography is enough. But sometimes um, you have to light it separately. I've done all kinds of things. I mean, experiment is really the answer there. Sometimes I use continuous photographic lighting. Sometimes, but again, it has to be in an appropriate ratio to the backlighting, or you'll overwhelm the backlighting, and there won't be much point in using the light box.
Okay. We had some questions on gear, of course, us being B&H. We always love when gear comes into the question. For the panoramas, Warren is asking, do you shoot the panoramas when using the light box? And what is your camera and tripod setup for that?
There's a fair amount of discussion of my camera and tripod setup, or at least tripods generally. There's a chapter on tripods in creative garden photography. I consider a tripod an incredibly important piece of equipment, and I've never quite understood why people are willing to spend thousands of dollars on cameras but bulk at a $1,200 tripod. But because in some ways it's my most important piece of gear. But the so I'm not quite sure how to answer this question. Yes, the panoramas are shot on a light box. And you know, you could use a specific panorama rig for it, or you could basically understand where the nodal point is when you move, and move your camera and tripod horizontally along the light box to create the overlap in the images. Once or twice I've actually laid out a track and measured it so I get it exactly right, but usually I just eyeball it and move the camera down with a good tripod.
Okay, and we did have some more questions on the logistics of these flat lays. If you're laying out the flowers flat, do you lay them directly on the light pad? As far as how you place everything out, can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah. I mean, the short, again, as I said in the presentation, I think the arrangement is the most important part of all this. I mean, you can have all the photographic technique you want in the world, and if you don't have something interesting to photograph, it wouldn't help you much. You know, putting that in a different perspective, as Ansel Adams is quoted as having said, sometimes I'm put in exactly the right place to press the shutter. So if you want to be a better photographer, stand in front of more interesting things. And if you want to be a really better photographer, become a more interesting person. So, yeah, the arrangement really is important. To be practical about it, most of the time I lay it directly on the light box. Now, sometimes you might want to photograph down on a blossom that is a vertical blossom. So that can't go sideways on a light box because you won't see the vertical blossom. So I've done all kinds of insane things to make that work. A lot of it involves, Rube Goldberg, MacGyver kinds of things with paper clips and tape and various kinds of brackets holding things up. I think in some ways, the best way to learn how to do this is to do it hands-on. And, I don't give workshops in this very often, but live hands-on workshops is really the way to go.
Yeah, I was
So,
gonna say when you think about it, like I'm thinking, I'm doing the math in my head, and I'm like, wait, if you're overlapping anything, and if you have some stuff that is you have different opacities of the petals and different colors that are going to react differently, you're taking one general exposure, right? When you're on a light box, so there's got to be some manipulation of, a
well,
lot
actually,
of
you're taking 6 to 8 exposures, but the
so.
the technique is to blend the exposures before you stitch the panorama.
But is that going into your thought process as far as because you want to create you have I guess what I meant is a one at the end of
You've
the
got
day
a
when you
you've
blend.
got a good point there, Derek. I mean, I really have to keep track of how I've done what. And sometimes, that means taking notes as you do it.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm thinking of it and I'm like, man, I would get lost thinking of like, okay, did I expose for this or am I exposing for this and where is this going? And you ultimately you have the one final piece in mind, but it's taking you various steps of very different types of exposures and
Oh,
light.
that's really true. It's really true. It's not necessarily completely intuitive as to how to get there. And
Okay.
yes, as with many kinds of photography, it really helps to have good pre-visualization skills in terms of knowing where you're going. The one way I like to put that, though, is that when I take a project, let's say if it's a self-directed project rather than an assignment or something, I like to think of this as a quest in the sense that medieval knights went out on a quest. But while I'm on that quest, perhaps I'm going to see a sidetrack of some sort. Well, by all means, I can get sidetracked and add things to it on the spur of the moment too. So it's not like these are rigidly planned images in advance. Of course, another thing is that I've been doing this for long enough by now that I have a pretty good sense of what might work, what might not work, and how the flow goes. But yes, these are complicated images that involve successful application of photographic tools, techniques, and equipment, as well as post-production tools, techniques, and equipment. And you have to take steps to keep your workflow very straight. And that's a fairly big topic in and of itself that I really didn't touch on here.
And I think a lot of beauty comes from the amount of work that you're putting in and the thought, and just not everybody can do it. Not everybody sees in that way where they can arrange all of that stuff in their mind and come up with a beautiful product on the outside end. We did have some questions on: do you shoot in a dark room? Does the light in the room matter? Have you ever experimented with UV light?
The light in the room matters a lot. I don't usually shoot in an entirely dark room, although sometimes I have. I've experimented a lot with lighting. Most of the time, I do this work in a room where I have a great deal of control over what the ambient light looks like, where it's hitting the light box, how much of it is, how soft or hard it is, and things like that. I do find that sunlight is really good for the ambient portions of this. I like to work with controlled natural lighting. I've never experimented with UV, but that sounds interesting.
Definitely. Well, Harold, I want to thank you. I think that wraps up our questions here. Again, if Harold did leave his information there, so definitely do go check out his work. Give him a follow on Instagram. And if you do have any questions, reach out. This is super interesting. This is way more in depth. That I was interested to see how you were going to approach everything, and it's really even far beyond what I thought the process was going to be.
Well, thank you, Derek. It was really fun to get to share it with everyone. And don't be scared to try this, please. It's one of those things where, with some fairly basic photo equipment and visualization, really interesting imagery can be made. Thanks,
Yeah.
Derek. I really appreciate it.
Huge thank you to you, Harold, and to all of our viewers that tuned in. Huge thank you to you out there as well. Will be available to watch at your own leisure on our YouTube page. If you go over, look up B&H Event Space on YouTube, you can watch this and all of our other recorded content on there as well. Huge thank you to Harold once again. That's all we got in the books for you today. Another rendition of the B&H virtual event space now in the books. Catch y'all next time.